My name is Anthony Clayton and I'm the Professor of Caribbean Sustainable Development. Well, we were concerned about a number of related issues. One was obviously climate change and the fact that the world is still very heavily dependent on fossil hydrocarbons, and burning these hydrocarbons releases the carbon into the atmosphere, where it stops some of the heat from escaping and starts to warm up the planet underneath. And if we don't find somewhere else to get our energy from, or become much more efficient with how we use energy, then the problem is that the climate will continue to warm up, the sea levels will rise, it will affect the pattern of rainfall around the world, and we're going to have major problems with the development of new disease vectors, with flooding, extreme weather conditions, some of which may make life in the Caribbean extremely difficult. So that was one of the reasons. Another reason was that here in Jamaica, we live in a country that was almost entirely dependent on imported oil for its energy needs. Now, this wouldn't be an economic problem if oil remained cheap, but it doesn't. We saw over the course of a 10-year period, the price of oil go up 15-fold. If you're an oil-dependent importing economy, then you have no buffer against the economic shock that this creates. What then happens is the cost of doing everything in that economy goes up. The costs of manufacturing, the cost of goods and services, the cost of essential facilities like cooling and lighting and so forth. So it's really not a good place to be. You really need to think in terms of how you can diversify your energy sources and also how you can be more efficient with how you use energy. But finally, we realized that the really critical issue wasn't primarily where we got our energy from. It was the efficiency and the productivity with which we used it. Now, when we thought about this some more, we looked at the different sectors of the economy, and we looked at how we use energy, where we use energy, some in transport, some in housing, and so on. And we decided to focus on the built environment because that is where you can actually make the greatest savings in the most cost-effective manner in the shortest time and find economic incentives for people to do so. So we looked around to see what was possible now in terms of making buildings more energy efficient, and we decided not to go, for incremental energy efficiency improvements, which most energy projects do choose. We decided to go for state-of-the-art, and state-of-the-art is in fact a building that actually runs on a net zero energy. Or, now obviously this doesn't mean from moment to moment. It means that over, for example, the course of a year, you generate as much power as you consume. And then what you do is you use the grid as your backup, so that when you're generating more power than you're consuming, you're actually exporting power to other people. And then when you're in those occasions when you're actually using more than you're producing, then you can run that in reverse and import power back from the grid. So you're net zero over a reasonable period of time. We realized that if we could have every house in Jamaica, every building in Jamaica built to these kinds of standards, then we could actually think in terms of trying to shut down power stations, obsolete power stations, because the built environment would be making a larger and larger contribution to energy generation in this country. So for all three reasons, this seemed to us to be an intrinsically extremely worthwhile and potentially very significant project. Alright, the main deliverables are, firstly, proof of concept. We're going to demonstrate that this kind of building is actually feasible in Jamaica, which means, of course, it will be feasible not just in the Caribbean, but in all of the subtropical regions of the world. So potentially this really is a game-changing project. Most of the regions of the world with the most rapidly increasing population are tropical and subtropical. So if we can develop a solution that works in this kind of climate, with this kind of temperature regime, then we've got something that could actually go a significant way towards solving many of the planetary problems that we're now facing. With regard to Jamaica, what of course we want to do is demonstrate that if we can make this kind of thing work, and if we can roll it out into the mainstream, which we can do by working with, for example, planning and building codes, to make sure that everything that gets built from now on is built to comparable standards, then we can actually do something about making Jamaica increasingly energy independent, because our own buildings will actually be generating the power that we need. That means we will be less and less dependent on the on international markets for any form of energy, whether it's oil or LPG or some other form of energy. So it means that we will be making a structural change in our economy and permanently insulating it from energy price shocks in future. Plus, of course, we'll be putting disposable income, money, directly back into people's pockets. If your light bills go down, then this is money which you then have to spend on other things. So you would get an economic stimulus resulting from the fact that one of the major items of what is really not non-discretionary expenditure would be significantly and permanently reduced. So you get the economic benefit, the environmental benefit, and you actually get the macroeconomic benefit, because you're then going to be able to manufacture and produce on a more competitive basis. Well, what the hoped for response is that people will see that this is where their own personal interests lie. You see, I think you can only go so far by telling people this is the right thing to do for environmental reasons. And you can't go much further by telling people this is the right thing to do for the state of the economy. Where I think you do get some traction is where you tell people, if you make sure that your next house or this house that you're building can perform to these standards, then you're actually going to substantially and permanently reduce the running cost of that building. And that will make you significantly better off than you were before. So, looking with this kind of argument, we hope to get some significant purchase on the thinking of people working in construction, architects, engineers, and of course the policy community. But where we really need to go is in terms of general public understanding that this should be so basic that when you're looking to buy a house, that one of the important criteria is you should look at the energy performance of that building. If you fail to do so, then it will cost you dearly over the lifetime of that building. You wouldn't go and buy a car without thinking about its performance and what it's going to cost to run, or at least you shouldn't. So we need to try and get there with how people think about their houses. Well, if we could make every building in the world net zero, we would reduce world energy demand by about 40%. And if we go for next generation, which is energy plus buildings, which just basically means making sure that each building is slightly net positive, then we go over 40%. At this point, we actually really restructure the global economy. We then don't need a very large oil and gas industry or a coal industry. We can satisfy remaining demands almost entirely from renewables, not overnight, but that would take probably a couple of decades to get there. But it means that you could actually reduce our dependence on fossil hydrocarbons over time to probably close to zero. Now that's a really transformative effect. It means that you're no longer dependent on the oil exporting countries, which would be a shock for them, but it would be enormously beneficial for by far the larger part of the world population. And it would solve our problems with that problem I mentioned earlier of climate change. It would, again, not overnight, because it takes many, many years to build up the level of carbon dioxide that we have now in the atmosphere. and it will take many, many decades to reduce it back to pre-industrial levels, in fact probably several centuries. But once we start to make this transition, then we move from a path of increasing climate change to a path of first controlling and then ultimately diminishing climate change. So we move the planet back within safe parameters. That's not bad. Well, the role of the ISD is really to do high impact, policy relevant research, so that we actually, with this project and with several other projects, we've gone looking for, and I think have been very successful in finding potential solutions to most of the major developmental issues and challenges facing this country, facing this region, and in fact facing the world. And then the next part is, of course, getting these ideas out into the mainstream so that people actually start utilizing them. So we don't see ourselves as being academic in the narrow sense of the world. Yes, of course, we have to do research that will stand up to any level of scrutiny. It has to be extremely good. But at the same time, we don't want our main output simply to be published research papers. We want, in addition, to actually change the climate of opinion, the kinds of choices that people make, and the way that particular technologies develop, so that we can move from the development path that we're on now, which we think is not a very good one, and has a lot of very serious problems associated with it, to a better development path, where we can get we're looking for the combination of outcomes, where we've got low and reducing levels of environmental damage, very significant economic gains, and major developmental opportunities, all of which we think we can get if we shift from the current energy development path onto the better one that we think that we can now not just describe, but actually demonstrate and prove. I think so, because we've already had a lot of interest in this particular project here, and not just from the Caribbean, but from further afield. So I think the interest is there. We just need to demonstrate that this project really is going to work, and then track it over a period of time. Demonstrate that yes, this is either what we want or close to what we want. And then we need to make sure that people are aware of that, and we can try and get these ideas taken up by the policy community, of course. But I think probably it's just as important to persuade contractors and builders, engineers, architects, because whatever politicians do or do not do, it's the people who actually put the houses up and who purchase the houses that you need to also convince. Once the market starts to shift, I think the policy environment will probably shift too. But we won't neglect the policy community. We do a lot of work, as you know, on trying to say, how can we at least facilitate this? How can we make sure that we don't put unwanted legislative or economic impediments in the way of moving this country to a better development path? Well, we need to convince people like Ministry of Energy, Ministry of Local Government, and we need to convince the Environmental and Planning Agency that these are actually viable solutions. I think what we need to do is move from a kind of last generation, rather reactive idea of what environmental protection is all about, which was really about issuing a whole, and what planning is all about, which was really about issuing a whole set of thou shalt not. Thou shalt not build here because of whatever. I think what we're really looking for is a change in understanding of how much we can achieve, how much positive good we can achieve with a next generation approach to planning and development. We can actually start thinking about what kind of buildings we want, what we want our cities to look like, how our cities should work, what kind of buildings we need, what kind of transport systems we need, how our water systems should work. Because let's just extend this concept one step further. Instead of just thinking of this building by building, you start to think of the synergies that you can get when you think of a whole city. And the change, and what kind of work will people be doing 30 years from now? I doubt very much it will look anything very close to the pattern of work that engages people now. Our transport systems will be very different. We need to think much more intelligently about how we manage water, especially if we're going into a world of increasing water scarcity. So we need to think of all of these things and then find optimal solutions so that we end up with much more livable, much more attractive, much more economically productive, and much less environmentally damaging patterns of urban living. If we can do that, then I think we're getting quite close to the holy grail of sustainable development.